Assalamu alaikum ji. It is an absolute pleasure and privilege to have this conversation with Tariq Ali Sahib, who is a writer, activist, filmmaker, journalist, historian, novelist, playwright, and a public intellectual. And I could carry on, but perhaps those can somehow capture the vast range of his interests, his contributions over the years. Um, and just before we start formally, Tariq Sahib, I first heard about you from my father, who used to be at government college, and you were his senior. And then many years later, I actually heard you speak at the Oxford Union when I was a student there. And then several years later, I saw you at Harvard when you came to my supervisor, Duncan Kennedy's class. And I've met you a few times in Lahore, but of course, over the years, one has been deeply inspired by all your work. And what we're going to do at the Faiz Festival, inshallah, this year is to inaugurate and launch your memoir from 1980 to 2024 called "You Can't Please All." It's an extensive volume, and I must confess that a volume which it is very hard to capture in an hour or even 2 hours because such is the multifariousness of the themes. But without further ado, perhaps we could start off a little bit about a section which really fascinated me, partially because I think Mia Iftikharuddin's house, which you mentioned in a family interlude, is perhaps 500 meters from where I am right now. And I especially set off with my daughter to show her the house and to tell her how significant it is and that I'm just reading about it. You mentioned elsewhere in the book that you have seldom spoken about your family years and your parents, with such candor and sort of nostalgia, which you do here. And I think a lot of us are incredibly glad that you did. But it sort of inspired me to ask you a little bit about your relationship with Lahore. You've lived in London for most of your life now, and you've been all over the world. But it seems to me from this family interlude that there's a lot which is evocative intellectually, but also emotionally when it comes to Lahore. And earlier, of course, also Wah and that wonderful area where you still find remnants of the Gandhara civilization. So if you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, Lahore has been my first love. It's a city I was born in, a city I grew up in, and a city, even when I was banned from Pakistan by successive military dictators, I never forgot either the country or its people. And thirdly, Lahore. I knew the city well. I knew many parts of it. I loved it dearly. I went to school here. I studied at Government College, Lahore, when we were lucky, I think, to have one of the great educationalists and principals of all time. Probably there's no one been like him. There was no one like him before and no one like him since. And that's Dr. Nazir Ahmad, a great scholar of Punjabi literature, of Urdu literature, a great friend of Faiz and Sufi Tabassum and Victor Kiernan and many, many others. So we were lucky. And even though Pakistan had just come under its first military dictatorship in October 1958, Dr. Nazir, when I finally got to Government College, had just taken over as principal. And he said to us, look, what happens outside these four walls of the college, I am not responsible for. But within the college, I would advise you to study outside your classes as well. Set up study circles. Read whatever you want to read. No one can stop you reading inside the college. And afterwards I said, but Dr. Saab, that's kind and, we love you dearly for saying that. But there are not too many books in the library that we want to read.
Sure.
So he said, वो People's Publishing House वाले हैं, बाहर उनसे किताबें ले आओ, that be the People's Publishing House outside, go and get books from them, which we did. So I'm very grateful to him, actually, of all the people who've taught me, and not that he taught me directly. He had a very big impact on us, and this was in Lahore. And as a result of wide reading, as I describe in the book, when Patrice Lumumba, the great Congolese patriot and leader, was killed, I called a meeting of students, and a few hundred students turned up, 400 or so. And I told them who Lumumba was, said he's just been killed by the Americans, I'm sure of it, and we can't sit still in college today. We have to go out onto the streets and mourn Lumumba's death. So we marched from Government College Lahore to Government House, and we marched to the American consulate and honored Patrice Lumumba. And I'm very proud to say that this was the first ever demonstration on Patrice Lumumba to defend him. Now, of course, he's a huge figure in post-colonial thought and study. But at that time, we were the first to recognize him, and I'm very proud that Lahore had the first demonstration. So it was a cosmopolitan city still.
Yes.
You could do this. No one objected to that. It's when on our way back from that demonstration that some of us started shouting democracy in Pakistan and an end to the military dictatorship that people began to get nervous. But on Lumumba, there was no opposition. And I still run into people, usually at airports in the United States, Pakistanis from Lahore, who say Yaad hai ji or Lumumba da jalus, uda muqabla nahi. And the number of people who were on the jalus were about 400 or 500. But now if you look at it, everyone was on the demonstration. We were there. So it's one of the things that gets imprinted in your memory. And because of that and close links with my parents, who were progressive people, so I was very close to them and learned a lot from them and the people who came and were in our house often, Faiz Saab, Sibte Hassan, Sajjad Zahir, before they were arrested. They were in and out of our house, and one of them used to joke, Sibte used to joke, we are in and out of your house and we're in and out of prison at the same time. So it's a nice relaxation to be here. And that was my Lahore, the Lahore of my youth and childhood, and I never forgot it. I have many, many happy memories of it. And one thing I just want to talk about, which people don't know anymore.
Sure.
Current generations of Lahore have no idea, many of them. This was that Lahore was a very progressive city. Sure. You were describing Aikman Road, Mia Iftikharuddin's house on Aikman Road, yes. 21 Aikman Road. This was a huge center of progressives, like our house was, but Mia Saab's was on a grander scale. Nehru came there, Congress leaders, Communist Party leaders, visitors from China. Zhou Enlai came to have lunch there when I was about 11 or 12. So it was for us a very important house. And Mia Iftikharuddin and my father and others, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Sibte, would talk a lot to each other on their own. They were all radicals, inspired by Marxism of one sort or another. And Mia Saab came up with the thought that we've got a new country now, Pakistan. A new country needs many things. A new country needs a chain of newspapers. Okay. And why don't we set up and create a chain of newspapers? And he roped in Faiz Saab and my father and others. He wanted progressives to edit and professional journalists to make sure the standards remained high. There was one problem. that they had to get the permission of Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So Mia Saab went to see him, Mia Iftakharuddin, and said to Jinnah, you've given us a new country, but we have to have a set of newspapers. Do we have your permission? Jinnah said, very good idea. I'll be one of the founders of it. So that is how this contradiction came about, that a country that in the 1950s decided to go with the United States and work with them, unlike India, which remained neutral in the Cold War, that this country, which was effectively an American stooge state, also produced the best and most progressive newspaper chain in Asia, probably. And this lasted from 1946, and then the military government in 1959 took these newspapers away from the owners of Progressive Papers Limited. They were nationalized, and a whole generation of civil servants, students, school children, young people in general who were literate, had been brought up on this chain of newspapers. Pakistan Times in English, Imroz published in Lahore and Karachi in Urdu, Lail Nehar, a very highbrow literary journal in Urdu, edited by Sibte Hassan. When a generation grows up with this level of journalism, even if they don't agree with it, they're educated. And I run into people, and have done over the years, who recall this period. I find it quite shocking, actually, that this period of Pakistani history from 1947 to 1958 is very poorly recorded.
Yes.
It's not studied seriously. I'm not talking about in Pakistan, where it should be studied. But there's so many Pakistani students abroad, not a single PhD on the Progressive Papers Limited and how a newspaper chain can impact on a country. And papers were taken away from me after Iftakharuddin by the state on the say-so of the United States. They did not want an anti-imperialist newspaper chain in Pakistan, which is why I think it's extremely important to remember this period of history, because history shows what was once done can be done again, even though in very different circumstances.
No, that's fascinating. Dr. Nazir, from all accounts, my parents' account, yours, other people from that generation, was one of those iconic people who had such a huge impact in terms of generating an intellectually curious environment and free exchange of ideas. But I think it's fantastic that you have highlighted the Progressive Papers. That was going to be my next question, and to a great extent, you have sort of elaborated on that, but I also wanted to link it up with the fact that throughout your life, you have actually been associated with progressive publication, whether it's in England, the New Left Review, the writings you do in various other papers. Yours has been a life of writing, and you're right, it needs to be documented better. But just to dwell a bit more on the fact that when you take away this oxygen, this capacity of a society to be able to engage in a progressive discourse, how lasting and how deep is the damage, and how does one undo it? Because what we are witnessing over the last decade or so increasingly is a further hardening of the state's attitude towards free speech, and a whole host of factors have led to making it more difficult to speak. Although I must confess that as somebody who works on constitutional history and human rights, I still thank my stars that this place is much better than a lot of other countries I can think of. We have managed to push back over the years. There have been valiant sort of recordings of dissent. So the battle carries on. But in a more structured, in a more institutionalized manner, there's really still a need to have journalism, which is much less partisan, much more informed, and doesn't infantilize things. So how do you see that happening? Not just in Pakistan, but I think that's a battle elsewhere as well, as far-right politics is emerging and harder states are coming onto the scene.
I think these are very important questions. I mean, let's look at the world now, on the eve of the Faiz Festival in Lahore. What the Israelis, backed by the United States and the West in general, have been doing in Gaza, virtually all the human rights groups created by the West have said this is a genocide.
Yes.
And the world lets it happen. The Western world watches it. Of course, there's dissent in the United States, very important dissent, but they try and curb that dissent by saying universities can't allow these things to be discussed at the university. Harvard has just passed accepted motions that change the definition of anti-Semitism, which is a disgrace to that university. So the whole world is upside down. Pakistan now seems quite advanced, that we did all these things decades ago. Yeah. And it seems the rest of the world is now following us. And I'm sure there will be some generals who will say, देखो वो भी अब यही कर रहे हैं, तुम हमें गालियां देते रहते हो. So this sort of thing is now common. And I think we're witnessing changes on a global scale which will shock many people who believe that the West and what it does and how it operates is the answer to all our problems. It never was. It certainly isn't now. I mean, just imagine if what is being done to the Palestinians was being done to a people whose governments were allied to the West. You wouldn't have had a day's silence. I mean, the killing of Palestinian children now is an everyday occurrence. The Western media barely mentions it. It's quite disgusting, actually. And this, I think, is going to have a generational impact in terms of trust in mainstream media outlets. Now, of course, many people say we have alternative outlets. The birth, existence, development of the internet gives us ways to communicate with each other which we never had before. And I have to say, when I think back on the past, had we had these methods of communication in the late 1960s, in Pakistan, where we had a successful uprising against a dictatorship, and in other parts of the world, we would have had probably twice, 3 times as many people on the streets as we did at the time, which now seem enormous. So there are ways beyond it, but now they're trying. I mean, this idiot Musk has bought over Twitter, uses it as a platform to promote a particular political party. So increasingly, the universality of many of these networks is under challenge. They publish what they want to publish. So soon this space will probably disappear. So we will have to find other means of communicating, etc. But the need to communicate is absolutely vital to insist on accountability, whether the government is that of the United States or that of China or that of Pakistan or that of India. I mean, India is formally speaking a democracy. Modi hasn't done away with it. He himself suffered badly, didn't get an overall majority. So, of course, there are good things about a functioning democracy. But the cultural atmosphere created in India, which is rampant Islamophobia, rampant attacks on many, many people from the so-called lower caste, on Christians, etc., that will take a long time to disappear. And even the opposition to Modi doesn't say that they're going to change too much on that front. So once you have this changed consensus, all the political parties are affected by it and grab it and are scared to change it in case they lose the next election. That's what politics has become. It's sort of, all the big working class parties globally have disappeared. If you look at Europe, in the United States, you never had a working class party. In Pakistan, what is the difference between the Sharif brothers and the Bhutto family? I mean, nothing. They make money. They have nothing to offer the people. They haven't even been able, either these parties or those or their patrons, have not managed to create health, education facilities for people without money. And that's a huge number of people in Pakistan. Now you have this situation where this single self-made billionaire who has been bribing every political party, every institution this country has ever had. But one of the reasons for his success and his billionaire status is that he does it for everyone. He doesn't particularly help one branch of the services or the other. He gives whoever asks him and he feels he can get something out of it, he will. They now, I'm told, want him to give evidence, but only against Imran. And the guy has fled to Dubai. He can't stay in Pakistan anymore. How long he'll stay there, we don't know. But till now, he's refusing to give evidence. Since he says in private, I've bribed everyone. I've got favors, I've built them houses. Why should I just victimize this guy who didn't get the most anyway? But that's the scale of the problem now, is that the discussions take place on this level. Should the guy who's given the bribe tell the truth or not? That's the debate. So politics is in a bad way, and democracy is being hollowed out in its heartlands.
Sure.
That is what we see. And they won't do away with it because they don't need to. It functions perfectly well. I mean, I remember I was once, during the Iraq War, I was giving a lecture in Houston, in Texas. And the lady who came to greet me at the airport and take me to my hotel, she said, I just want to warn you that virtually the entire audience tonight will be oil millionaires or billionaires who genuinely want to hear you. So really, you don't have to hold back. So I said, okay. I didn't hold back. And one guy, a perfectly friendly discussion, and one guy asked, he said, what do you think of this proposition? I said, what? He said, look at China, how it's developed, without any democracy at all and a single party in charge. We suffer because we have to make concessions to trades unions and other interests. Don't you think America would be a better off country if we were like China? So I said, China does other things which you haven't done as yet. And I take your point, but I said, the functioning of capitalism is not intrinsic to democracy. I mean, capitalism existed for hundreds of years without a trace of democracy. Democracy is something people have had to fight for everywhere, more or less, against the colonial powers, against empires, against their own elites. It's never granted, and we shouldn't destroy it, and we shouldn't undervalue it. So the guy said, yeah, no, I know all that. I just thought you'd say yes. I said, well, I don't say yes because I'm in favor of accountability and trade union democratic rights in China as well. I think it'll enhance them. It won't weaken them. So these discussions are going on that level. And if you look at the United States today, what do we have? We have one party which had been in power, completely wrecked by its failure to see what was going on in their own country, underestimating the anger at the genocidal war in Gaza, having Donald Trump speaking to a largely Muslim audience in Dearborn in Michigan and saying, I will then make a truce. And though his positions on all things are pretty useless, he did impose that truce. So for a few weeks, if not a few months, we will have people going back, regardless of whether they want it or not. Palestinians are going back to North Gaza. The Israelis thought they would never go back now, but they are going back. So discussion, debate, protests are a vital part of democracy. But the fact that Trump has won the Senate, he's won the House, he has the Supreme Court in his pocket, makes him one of the more powerful presidents in recent years, which means that something needs to be changed in the United States. It needs a new constitution, it needs new democratic structures, it needs possibly more power for the states. It's the states in that country. So that's the period we're living in, I think, Osama. It's a period of transition. Nothing is settling down.
Fair enough. And it's such a rich conversation. And there's seeds of so many potential conversations within it. Let me just list at least three, which immediately strike me, where we would really value and benefit from your further insight. One is really the larger sort of project of, progressive democracy. Democracy, as you're narrating, is taking a beating everywhere in one way or the other. And you have the right rising in a lot of places, and you have curtailment of rights. So, in many ways, the democratic dream, the liberal dream of liberal democracy, which one had, hasn't quite delivered. So what does one learn from the last 30 to 40 years in terms of which way the progressive democratic project should be heading? What should be done differently? That's one. The second is a question about imperialism, because you have been a very acute observer of imperialism in various ways. You've written about it, you've gotten to know, even befriended a lot of very key people who were fighting against it. And so your perspective is incredibly rich. So where does the global balance of power stand now, and where do you see it headed? And I think an offshoot of that, and what we would really like to hear, and you can take them in whatever sequence you think is logical, is more conversation on Palestine. Because when the book came out, and you've written a very sort of moving and evocative epilogue, The Ashes of Gaza, which sums up the entire tragedy, but also periodizes it and sort of discusses the various phases and how things have arrived at where they are now. But I was thinking also about what's happened during the last year in terms of international law, in terms of the unprecedented college protest in the US, which reminded one of the Vietnam era, perhaps, in terms of the dissent shown by, or the pushback by people all across the world, with notable exceptions in the Muslim countries, of course. But the very fact as a lawyer that I feel now that the term genocide, apartheid, colonization are being embraced in the international sort of legal discourse around Palestine, which wasn't the case. We had a wonderful Palestinian scholar last year at the Faiz Festival who elaborated in detail how some of these things may seem very unimportant at the time being, with so many killings taking place, but they do change the conversation for the future. But you have been a very close observer of the Palestinian situation. You write very movingly about Edward Said and about his various contributions. So, where do we go from here? What's the hope for the people of Palestine as things stand today?
I think one thing has to be said. Israeli military strength, backed by the United States and the Western countries in general, has resulted in the genocide, has resulted in the deaths of at least 100,000 people, mainly women and children, if not more, in front of the eyes of the world. Slight qualification there. the eyes of the world do not always see what is going on if these eyes only depend on the official media networks, because these networks are not reporting what is going on, but the world knows what's going on. The fact that a majority of people in this country, Britain, are opposed to the government policies, the fact that the newly elected Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, a despicable figure on every level, is now his ratings, after several months in power, are minus 35%. That is an indication that you can't attack people who are deprived of news. The news still gets through to them. The same in the States. There's no one. 3 opinion polls have now revealed in the United States that it is Biden's unrelenting, crazed backing of Israel that led to lots of people not voting for the Democrats. Big mass abstentions. And some voting for the Greens, others turning to Trump. The Democrats basically lost this election. They hate to acknowledge this. All of them were on the same line. Obama, the Clintons, Biden, and then for extra help, they recruited the Cheney family. You know, hardcore Republican families centrally involved in the killings in Iraq. What effect is this going to have on Palestine? I think what the Israelis have done has been seen now by many generations, including a generation of young Jews in the United States of America. The Jewish, anti-Zionist Jewish demonstrations in the United States have no precedent whatsoever. This is the first time that it has happened on this level, and I salute them. You know, it's fantastic that young Jews insisted on occupying the Grand Central Station alone in New York. Very moving gesture. And here too in Britain, Jews for Palestine. And of course, Orthodox Jews of many varieties don't believe in Israel. So it's not a question of hostility to the Jews, it's a question of hostility to Zionism. And the fact that my friends Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein have said they are no longer in favor of the existence of Israel should be something to be taken seriously. They are not alone. So what state do we need? We need a state, a single state with equal rights for everyone. Jews, non-Jews, every type of Jew, Muslim Palestinians, Christian Palestinians, Mizrahis, everyone. No discrimination whatsoever. And an end to Israel being seen as an attack dog or behaving like an attack dog of the United States, altering the political geography of the region whenever asked to do so. One shouldn't underestimate the close links between the US and Israel. And of course, people talk of the Israel lobby, and Meir Shaima Wald wrote the book. That plays a part. It'd be crazy to deny it. But I do not believe that the ruling elite of the United States allows its very real deep interests to be determined by money their legislators are being paid by the Israelis. That's for votes. The people who decide on what the interests of the United States are the people who are telling Trump, take Greenland, take Canada. Now, someone asked me the other day in a podcast interview, what do you think of this? I said, well, look, what I think of this is that this is how imperialism acts. This is how the United States was founded, expansionism. They took Mexico, large chunks of Mexico. They took Hawaii, they took Puerto Rico, and taking Canada is no different from that. And I said the rest of the world needs a rest. from American takeover, so let them concentrate on Canada. Denmark, which is the most slavishly pro-American country in Europe, is now understanding what it means to deal with an imperial power. Mm-hmm. When Donald Trump rang up the Prime Minister, called her out, bawled her out, and said, you know, what gives you the right to think Greenland belongs to you? So these things seem like jokes, they're not jokes. It means that someone or a group of people in the United States are thinking now of expanding the empire within their own particular European and North American framework, and to use that as an ultra-imperialist bloc with which to take on China if China really threatens it or its interests militarily, which the Chinese don't. The Chinese defense and foreign policy is largely determined by their own needs and interests, and it's a defensive mechanism, as you can see in the number of money spent by both countries on weaponry, arms, and military bases. The Chinese is totally defensive. China threatens them economically because it's grown so fast, as some predicted it would do once it changed its policies, which Deng Xiaoping did in the late 80s and 90s. So this is the world we live in. What is going to happen to the world? I mean, I could be ultra-utopian and say that America will not change unless there are huge movements and uprisings within that country. Mm. No outside power can compel change unless, you know, you want to destroy the world and go and have a nuclear battle, which some of the Europeans stupidly have been threatening Russia with on Ukraine. The Americans won't let that happen, obviously, and Trump now wants a settlement there. I mean, you know, the question has to be asked of the United States, what more do you want? You've got large chunks of the world. You've destroyed the Arab world. You've got its gas and oil under your control. You're thinking about invading Iran, not because Iran is a threat to you, or for that matter to the Israelis, but because you don't want Iranian sovereignty to determine whether that country sells oil and gas to China. That's the big problem you don't like. So if the Iranians say, we won't do it without your permission, they'll do a deal. The Americans will do a deal. They've been hovering around it. But then that's the end of the clerics regime. If they do that in Iran, they might as well go the whole way. And the Chinese are not going to start a third world war to defend Iran. You know, they'll find other sources. But this is the situation in which we find ourselves today. It's a world of uncertainties, both in each single country. Most people, the majority of people, just want basic things. A government which offered a majority of the people a decent social infrastructure, hospitals, schools, education, people will be quite happy. They have no big grand dreams as in the 20th century. I remember I was researching one of my books on Pakistan, The Duel, and I went around interviewing people, ordinary people in Karachi, Lahore, other cities, just walking into the bastis in the poor areas and interviewing people. And I would ask one question, usually, to see Chande Kiyo. What do you need? What do you want? And I tell you, the answer was usually the same. 2 meals a day, medicine, a bit of shelter, and education. So I'd say, yeah, I understand this. And they would say to me, stop. The education we want is the education that gives our kids a chance. We want our kids to learn English. अंग्रेजी में पढ़ाओ हमें भी. And these are basically standard issue reformist, decent demands, Osama. It's not asking for the world.
But
It's saying you own the baker's shop. We'll accept that, but just give us a naan or a mithai, just a little tiny bit to share.
But wasn't ideological politics always about the fact that without certain structural changes, fundamental structural changes, this is not going to happen? It seems, though, as you're describing things, and indeed there's a lot of evidence for that, that things have been reduced now to these very fundamental and very fair demands. But there is an ideological vacuum when you look at global politics. And one wonders then that, is there any room still for ideological politics? We look at most countries, as you were describing earlier, and there's hardly any discernible difference between parties which are supposed to be on opposite end of the spectrums, barring, let's say, really populist parties or far-right parties. Democrat, Republicans, there's not much of a difference. BJP, Congress, and you mentioned Pakistani parties as well. So how do you see the politics of the left? How does it still have a role to play?
Well, I think they do have a role to play. But I don't think there's any uniform answer. In the old days, the uniform answer used to be, let's create a new party. It can be a Maoist party, it can be a pro-Soviet party, it can be a Trotskyist party, it can be and the structural model of these parties was, whatever their ideologies, effectively the same. This is how the parties should be built. This is how the parties should be run. Now, the time for that model is gone. I think in parts of Germany, in France, people are trying to come up with new models which are more movements rather than top-heavy democratic centralist organizations. But coupled with that, there is something unhealthy going on the right and on the left. On the right, you see it in this huge sort of cult of Trump, or this cult of Musk. A billionaire and a politician, both promoted as individuals, not as parts of an institution. That institution and those institutions are there in the background. But this is the form politics is taking. And the left, I have to be honest here, though I support them in general, but they too are looking for this model of finding a person who we can lift up, make into our leader, etc. But in France, you have Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's very effective, but he's very special and comes from another generation. I don't think the generations of today should even look in that direction. The aim should be to create organizations which actually involve the people on some level or the other. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's something easy. But that whole tradition, in Pakistan, what is the tradition? A press conference. All the political parties, they did no real work. It was press conference parties. Ring so-and-so, 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 give a press conference, next day it'll come in the papers that we gave a press conference and we said this and that's enough. That was the tradition in Pakistan, and then we chose particular leaders like Bhutto, for instance, who he died a tragic death, and I knew him and I really miss him even. He shouldn't have been dealt with like that. It goes without saying. But from that, you can't say he made no mistakes. And those mistakes were, in my opinion, unnecessary mistakes. They're mistakes people don't even talk about, because to talk about those mistakes then reminds you of another period in Pakistani history which is forgotten. I bet you if you go to the majority of universities and schools in Pakistan and say in each class, how many of you know that Bangladesh was once part of Pakistan and it was called East Pakistan? I don't think you'd have too many hands go up. If kids are lucky to grow up in families who talk about that, okay. But by and large, that history has been wiped out. And a country, a nation, a state that wipes out its own history suffers. And this is what has been happening. And this is happening globally too. I mean, Pakistan, as I said, is the pioneer on many issues. But when Trump stands up and says to people, we wouldn't have defeated Hitler without the help of the Soviet Union, you have to ask, what world are you guys living in? And of course, he was challenged, but by very few newspapers. I mean, the Second World War, which couldn't have been won without the Red Army and without the Soviet Union, has now become a great Western triumph. They'd have been wiped out ages ago if Hitler hadn't invaded the Soviet Union. So I'm saying that on many different levels, in order to promote their current ideas, they have to rewrite, distort history as well. So I think the one thing in Pakistan which would be worth thinking about is not simply to talk politics and the demands that flow from it when things are organized, but actually to talk to people about the history of their region.
Of course.
Punjab, Balochistan, Pakhtunkhwa, Sindh, the country as a whole, and to teach people history, teach the people from below a history from below, that this is what happened to our country. We could have been different.
So that actually leads very well to my next question, because in many ways, the gaps in a nation's understanding of history are filled by writers, by even writers of fiction, and there's this remarkable link between politics and literature and history. And just I was listening to you, a memory came to my mind from the late 80s when I used to visit the office of Viewpoint. And I had the pleasure of seeing your father there off and on. I used to go and see Zafar Iqbal Mirza, and Elis Faiz Saiba would be there, and Shafqat Tanveer Mirza. And I realized now that not only were they deeply steeped in an ideological politics, but also had a very sort of close link with the world of literature and how literature could be used to express yourself. And you have, of course, a very close, another very sort of prominent dimension of your personality and your work is fiction. And you're a playwright as well, and you wrote the Islam Quintet, which is a remarkable and unique piece of writing about Islamic civilization. So I wanted to ask you both. And then, of course, Faiz Festival. Faiz Saab is a prime example of being politically incredibly expressive and yet also being lyrical and leaving us with so much which we still recite. I wanted to talk to you generally about how you look at literature and its role in all this. I mean, there's literature, of course, purely for its aesthetics, but there's literature as a most potent language of politics. And you've done both. So just some views on that.
Well, two things have to be said here. One is that what you are, what you have become in terms of politics influences you in everything you write.
Sure.
So it's very difficult for a comrade or a socialist or someone heavily immersed in progressive politics, when she or he turns to writing poetry or literature, for these political views to disappear. You're the same person, right?
Yes.
And the 20th century which was a revolutionary century, a political century, a century which challenged capital and empire on every level, produced some of the great poets in our world. I mean, you can start off with Bertolt Brecht,
Yes.
the German genius. I mean, everyone in Germany, even the ones who hate him, recognize he was one of their great people. When Germany was being reunited, the Social Democratic leader stood up at a closed conference of the German Social Democratic Party, Helmut Schmidt, and said, "Do not treat our brothers and sisters from the East with contempt," which I've begun to notice. They have learned things which you never could. And he said, for instance, if there were a plinth of, say, 3 people produced by German culture, I would put on that Goethe, Heine, and Brecht.
Okay.
He said, and Brecht,
Okay.
because they understood. And that was, the same could be said about poets in our worlds. Pablo Neruda in Chile, great poet, member of the Communist Party. Nazim Hikmet in Turkey, the same. Faiz in Pakistan. And as Faiz would be the first to acknowledge, he was not alone. There was a whole progressive writers movement with him, behind him, of which he was a part. And this movement played a very big part in influencing young people and their ideas. I mean, when I was at Government College, Lahore, Faiz Saab's poems we knew, we loved and respected him. I'll never forget once at the height of martial law when Dr. Nazir invited him to speak at Government College Law, and he recited one poem, Bol ke lab azad hai tere, speak because your 2 lips are free. Or later when he was invited to Law College to read a poem at the convocation, I think it was, if my memory is right, when the pictures of the dictator Ayub Khan were hanging in all these institutions. Faiz Saab recited one poem, just one poem, Na hikayetein, na shikayetein, na vasare shab ke hoon bale, and then pointing to the picture of Ayub said, Teri ahd mein dil-e-zar ke sabhi ikhtiyar chale gaye. So this was the culture we brought up in. Ustad Daman, hun ho gayiyan maujain jiddat tak ko faujain fauja. A peasant poet from Baghbanpura. One of his family were tenants to Mia Iftikharuddin, who recognized his talents and basically put him on the stage of the subcontinent. Nehru used to come to Lahore, to Baghbanpura, to listen to him some of the time.
Habib Jalib and so many people like that.
Habib Jalib, I went round Pakistan with Habib Jalib speaking at Jalsas in 69. In all the big cities, I would give a speech, Jalib would read a poem, and towards the end of that exhausting tour, we were stealing each other's words, and he would tease me, saying, "Today I stole your speech. How did you make up a new one?"
That's a happy collaboration. Yes.
Even Femida Riaz, her poetry in defense of women, for God's sake, amazing.
Phenomenal.
Or in the 30s, the poet who came closest in some ways to Brecht was Sahir Ludhianvi. His poem on the Taj, on the Taj Mahal. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant Brechtian poem before he could have read Brecht.
Yes.
So this sort of stuff happened a lot, on a sort of lesser scale and level. It's the same with me. My series of novels, the Islam Quintet, which Edward Said was very insistent I write basically is the history of the clash of Islamic civilization against Western barbarism, against Western Christianity. They were the barbarians at the time. And lots of people, when the novels were translated into Italian and Spanish, said we learn our own history now through these books, because this isn't taught to us any longer. That Islam as a culture was dominant in Spain 500-600 years, and now a paragraph in a history book. So in order to recover that history, and also to show some of the ultra-conservative, orthodox, religious fundamentalisms of today, that Islam was not what you guys say it was. It was very different in character. There were dissenting voices. There were people who challenged everything without being fatwa'd or sentenced to death. They could do it because they had enormous confidence in their own culture and what they were doing, which you people don't have. That's why you resort to foolishness to try and impose your will, including violence. So that's why, Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, which is my novel about Islamic Spain, starts with a book burning and ends with a genocide. And a number of Palestinian friends asked me, did you have Palestine in mind as you wrote that? I said, no. I don't know, maybe. But I had our world in mind. This is what happens in our world. And this actually happened in Spain. And that book then became I don't know whether it still is, but certainly for long years it was a course book, a textbook in Spanish schools, because no one else had taught that history.
Sure.
So, it came to me to do, and then after I'd done that book, Edward said, don't stop now, tell the whole bloody story.
The Book of Saladin was next, I believe, then.
Yeah.
And then the three more followed, yes. And you talk frequently about Islamophobia, and in many ways this also counters that, apart from telling another side of the story, which is incredibly important. And then your play, The New Adventures of Don Quixote, you talk about how the introduction by Harold Bloom, almost reduces it, disentangles it, or just completely disconnects it from the entire Islamic Arabic context of Spain, which is also what you talk about in The Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree. Now that sort of raises a larger question for us writers as well, which is still a very sort of lopsided world when it comes to publishing and which stories get told, especially stories emerging from, for want of a better term, the global South. And I guess that act of resistance to tell your stories, it's also very easy to get co-opted and start telling stories which are more palatable. In many ways, the work Edward Said did in terms of Orientalism and demystifying and de-romanticizing the East is still incredibly relevant. And you'd be happy to know that he's probably taught in all public sector universities in Pakistan now as well. So are many other people, which wasn't quite the case 15 years ago. So are you hopeful when you look at writers from contexts similar to ours who are trying to stories which are anti-imperialist stories, anti-colonialism stories?
Look, to be perfectly frank, I wouldn't advise a writer to start writing a book or a poem saying this is going to be an anti-imperialist story, this is going to be a progressive story. It's what's in you. Let that flow out. If you go in with the idea of writing a particular story, history is different. You can, of course, fictionalize history and write a historical novel, which is what I've done and many others have done. But if you go in with simply that single idea, this is why during a certain period in Soviet history, socialist realism was a dead end.
Hmm.
There's not, I can't think, and I read a lot of Russian novels in translation, of a single socialist realist novel that did anything for me. And now, of course, it's admitted they were written to order. Some had brilliant sections in them, and some socialist realist paintings were very powerful, but by and large, as an imposed discipline, it didn't work. So we didn't go down that route. I think you have to let what's in you flow out of you. And it does when you're writing fiction. It's very different when I write nonfiction from fiction. When I'm writing fiction, I start, I have a general idea, and then some characters begin to emerge as I'm writing who I hadn't thought of at all.
Exactly.
In all my novels, this happens. And that's the case, I think, for most novelists. It's nothing unusual I'm describing. But, I mean, I was at a festival, literature festival in Istanbul, many years ago. I think when my book, the book of Saladin came out. And my publisher said to me, there are some dogmatic Islamists, this was before Erdogan was in power, who will ask you questions about women loving each other, lesbians, which is in your novel. And please deal with it calmly. I said, why do you think I'm going to get excited and, throw a fit? Well, of course I'll deal with it. They said, no, what we say, don't be provocative. So I said, no, I won't be provocative. So it came, they raised their hands. A guy raised his hand and said, in your novel, The Book of Saladin, you basically argue that two women were in love with each other. I said, yeah, that is one of the stories in the novel. But sir, please explain why you did that. I said, why I did that is because it happens. I said, I could answer you evasively and say it's fiction, I can make up whatever I want, and that'd be a legitimate answer. But in this case, throughout the history of the world, including the Islamic world, homosexuality has been very prevalent. I said, you read the Arabian Nights, filled with it in one form or the other. So this guy said, but you are saying that women can do that? The place was packed out, okay, well, 40% women. So I said, look at you. Let me just say something. Look at him, I said to the whole audience. Good-looking boy. Must have been about 30 or 40. Very neatly dressed, smart, intelligent, I said. Do you think if you had 4 wives and 50 concubines, which was the number quoted for Saladin's court, you could satisfy them all? At this point, the entire hall burst out laughing. I said, you're very good looking, but you couldn't do that. So why shouldn't women find solace in each other if they want to, even if they don't have any husbands or don't want them? So the thing calmed down. He was quite interested afterwards, by the way. He followed and wanted to discuss the issue further. So this is the way one, attempts to subvert the sort of foolish notions that exist about the Islamic world. And that was my aim, and by and large, I didn't get into any trouble, because these books weren't written with the object of provoking or getting into trouble, but just sort of reminding people and saying to people in the Islamic world, don't forget your history.
But you say also something very important about the fiction writer's craft in terms of not being completely driven by an ideology, but to let the story flow, for fiction to work, to be open to other ideas rather than just one's own biases and sort of ideologies. Um, I could carry on and on. The book is so multifarious, it's so extensive. You very kindly agreed to give us an hour, and we've already gone over time. So I think with your permission, I will conclude this wonderful conversation, which was incredibly illuminating. And I'm sure that our audience at the Faiz Festival will love it tremendously. We will, of course, introduce the book in greater detail and indeed also your work before we sort of play this video. But thank you so much for talking to me and for talking to us and for all your wonderful insights, and also indeed for this beautiful book, which I'm sure is now available in Pakistan. I bought it from here, and I'm sure a lot of people would love to read it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.